So I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining our second museum talk, Arctic, Arsenic, and Artifacts in the Footsteps of Greely. My name is Jillian Metcalf. I'm the Executive Director with the Osgoode Township Museum. And with me is Caitlin McDougall, Education Officer at the museum. We'll both be looking at your questions this evening and guiding those to our guest speakers, Sally and David Gray. So for those who are not familiar with the museum, we're located in Vernon, Ontario, which is the southernmost part of Ottawa. And we share the stories of rural and agricultural heritage of our area. We'd like to begin this presentation tonight by acknowledging that our museum, located in Vernon, Ontario, just south of Ottawa, is on the traditional and unceded ancestral land of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Algonquin Anishinaabe people are the original inhabitants of this territory along the Ottawa, Rideau, and Castor rivers, and have lived on this land since time immemorial. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. So a little snippet of our museum site. We are located on Bank Street. We have a beautiful 3-acre site, which includes a heritage school garden, an orchard, mud oven, as well as our 2 buildings, which is the main museum building and our agricultural barn. This is a quick shot of our main museum building, which hosts our permanent gallery space, which we just opened in December 2020. And then here you see our agricultural barn, which houses most of our agricultural collection, from threshing mills to fanning mills. We have a variety of agricultural-based artifacts here. So today we have 2 very special guests joining us, David and Sally Gray. The Grays have a long history of supporting the museum. We are very grateful to have them offer this talk for us. Thank you, Sally and David. The talk is scheduled to be an hour long, including a short time set aside at the end for you to answer questions and ask questions. You may type your questions in the chat, which is located at the bottom of your screen, throughout the presentation, and we will read them to Sally and David to answer at the end. Tonight, you'll get a glimpse at some of the experiences of the places that Greely and his men explored in the high Arctic. They will share photographs of places visited by Greely and his men, and also of artifacts from the expedition, as well as some of their own photos and experiences. So David Gray has been a researcher and writer specializing in the areas of environment, parks, local history, and archaeology ecology for 45 years. David's first zoological field research on the behavior of Ori marmots led to a Bachelor of Science thesis at the University of Victoria in 1967. This was followed by research on the behavior and social organization of musk oxen, including an overwinter study on Bathurst Island, leading to a PhD at the University of Alberta in 1973. Following 20 years as a museum scientist and curator, David is now an independent researcher, writer, and filmmaker. In 1991, he was elected Fellow of the Arctic Institute of North America in recognition of his contributions to Arctic science. David is a research associate at both Canadian Museum of Nature and the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and also a research affiliate at the Canadian Circumpolar Institute at the University of Alberta. And then we have Sally Gray. Sally brings to the team her experience as a government writer and editor at Natural Resources Canada and National Defence. Her writing interests are in science and technology, agriculture, and natural history. Sally wrote part-time for local newspapers, and today freelance writing, as well as working with Greyhound Information Services. For 4 years, she wrote a column in the 2 local newspapers, Seeing God in Nature. She recently apprenticed at the University of Ottawa Press for 6 months in order to learn more about publishing businesses as an editor. Sally has a BA in Physical Geography from Brock University and a diploma in Communication Arts from Mohawk College in Hamilton. So without further ado, I'm just going to stop my share and have David and Sally go ahead and share their screen, and we'll get started.
Okay, that's where we need to be, in Canada. Okay, it's a real pleasure to be with everyone tonight to talk about some of our experiences in the Arctic and relate them to our neighboring village of Greely. So, as Jillian has mentioned, I've had the privilege of spending a lot of time in the Arctic over the past 50 years now. And I've had really some amazing opportunities to travel all the way from Alaska over to Greenland and Iceland and all the way up to the northernmost part of Ellesmere Island. So it's been really amazing for me to experience this much of northern Canada, of the territories of Nunavut and the Inuvialuit settlement region and Nunavik as well. And so yeah, I'll just stop there and Sally will introduce her Arctic experiences.
Well, I guess what we'd like to do is ask how many people in the audience have been to the Arctic. I think Jillian will put a question up and you can check the box. We're just interested to know who we're speaking to. As for me, going to the Arctic was always a dream, just a dream until I met David. But since then, we've been to the Arctic together 4 times. And I've just been so hugely impressed, as everybody is who goes to the Arctic. It's magnificent and spectacular. The thing that impressed me the very most was the distances. You know, getting into an airplane and flying to Iqaluit seemed, I believe it's a 3-hour flight, but it seems forever. You're flying over ice and lakes. And so the distance is incredible. And then on one of our trips, we went to Grisfjord, which is the northernmost community in Canada. It's way at the north end of Ellesmere Island. And it's, you get into a plane again at Iqaluit and fly, it just seems like forever and ever. But then we forget the size of our country north-south. It's usually east-west that impresses us, but north-south is almost as big as east-west. I think 1,000 kilometers less only. So it's very impressive. And I think of Greely sailing up, how he had never been in the Arctic before. He was the leader of an expedition. I can just only imagine his thoughts as he steamed up through Davis Strait. It must have been quite an experience. You can reduce that, maybe.
I'm having difficulty changing slides. Oh, there we go. Now it works. So you may be wondering what the connection to Greely is. And it's actually an interesting question, because nobody knows for sure that our neighboring town of Greely and the Greely post office was named after Adolphus Greely, the American Arctic explorer. But it seems pretty certain that there is that connection. The post office was named in 1885, and the people of Ottawa and the surrounding areas, well, people all across Canada were very familiar with Greely and his expedition when it started in 1881, and when they were finally rescued in 1884 after 3 years in the Arctic. And in this slide, you can see what Adolphus looked like in his later years. He was younger than that when he first went to the Arctic. And his book about his Arctic service was published in 1886. So how did the people of Greely, how did the people of Ottawa know about the expedition? Well, it was in the newspapers. The Montreal Gazette and the Ottawa Citizen in particular, and the Ottawa Journal, and most of the newspapers in Canada carried a great deal of information about Greely and the expedition. So before we get into Greely and the expedition, I just want to talk a little bit about the Arctic lands in general. Often people think that the Arctic is a vast, empty space with nothing but cold ice and snow. But in actual fact, people have been living in the highest part of the Arctic for over 4,000 years. And on the left photograph here at the bottom, you can see a very rough ring of rocks, nothing that would really stand out unless you're looking at it very closely. But within that circle of rocks, I found the most exquisite little tools chipped out of chert or flint. And the people were living there 4,000 years ago. Their winter houses were a circle of rocks as a foundation and muskox hides tied over to protect them from the cold. Now, I cannot, for the life of me, imagine what it was like in the Arctic winter, living in basically a tent of muskox hides. And some people speculate that they practically hibernated in those days. The people were called the Independence people. Their culture was first identified in northern Greenland, and then people found that they were scattered all across the Canadian Arctic as well. On the right-hand side is what you can see, another stone structure. This one is a line of rocks, big rocks, and it's spaced in between them smaller rocks. So between every large rock, there's a series of small ones. And what this is a way of catching Arctic hares. It's called a hare drive or a hare snare. And they strung leather thongs with nooses between the big rocks that just hung over the little rocks. And Arctic hares in the high Arctic tend to occur in fairly large groups, and you can actually herd them, force them to move together in a direction you want them to go. And when they come to this snare line, they jump over the small rocks and hopefully get caught in the nooses. Now the people doing this were called the Thule people, and that was about in the era of 1,000 years ago. More recently, between 1,000 years ago and the present, people living in the Arctic were relying on the marine mammals, so that they established their communities on the coast. This is an aerial view of such a community on Bathurst Island. And each of these little circles you see is about 12 feet across. And the white things that you see are all bones of bowhead whales. So rib bones and skulls were used as the foundation in all of these houses. And then the baleen from the whales would have been stretched across the top of the house, and then skins on top of the baleen and the bone rafters. Now, those people were living in the Arctic about 1,000 years ago, but then retreated farther south as the climate changed and the bowhead whales were no longer going that far north. So the whole lands across Canada in the north were called Inuit Nunangat, and that simply means the land, the sea, and the ice that the people depend on. And it's interesting that that name is used, because we tend to think of owning the land, but the sea and the sea ice are extremely important in the Arctic, especially in those older days when people were completely dependent on the environment. When the first visitors came, explorers and traders and so forth, it's interesting that some of them immediately adopted the ways of some of the Inuit. They not took advantage, but they took the opportunity to learn from them, and their time in the Arctic became much more significant and enjoyable and productive because they adopted the ways of the people living there. Others, though, did not do that. And I guess one of the best examples we have is Franklin, Sir John Franklin's expedition that went into the Arctic in 1845. The scene in the background is Beechy Island, where several of the men died in the first winter and were buried there. On the right, you can see an old cigarette card depicting some of the artifacts that people found left behind by Franklin's expedition. And as you know, none of the Franklin expedition survived. They had no interest in learning from the local people. They saw local people on some of the islands, Inuit camping in the area, but they did not make any attempt to learn from them or to connect with them. In the days of exploration after Franklin, most of the expeditions in the high Arctic were looking for Franklin, and most of them were British. And again, most of them paid no attention to the local people, but carried on with their traditional British ways of doing things, man-hauling heavy sledges, heavy boats, all kinds of equipment that they really didn't need, and not making much of an effort to live off the land. And so they covered a lot of ground, but they didn't learn very much and made a lot of mistakes. On the other hand, the Inuit from Greenland and the Inuit from northern Baffin Island traveled easily back and forth from Ellesmere Island to Greenland, from Ellesmere Island to Baffin Island, and they did so using their traditional methods of dog teams, hunting on the land, hunting on the sea ice, living on the sea ice in their snow igloos where it was warmer than camping on the land. And the successful explorers were the ones that started to hire Inuit assistants to help them in their explorations. The whalers from Scotland and the United States and Denmark were the men mostly who came into the Arctic first and made the first major discoveries and traveled pretty far north. They were there to hunt whales because they had killed all the whale populations in their homelands and discovered that whales followed the Labrador Current up the west coast of Greenland. And there they encountered the Greenlanders, and they were smart enough to hire the men as harpooners for their whaleboats, and they hired the women to prepare clothing for them that was much more suitable to the Arctic than what they brought with them. And this woman with her little child on her back is busy scraping a skin to make into clothing for the whalers. So she's on a whaling ship. So after Franklin's expedition and after all the searching for Franklin, there was a fair bit now known about the Arctic islands. The geography was getting much better. We pretty much discovered the Northwest Passage and how you can get through from one coast to the other. And the explorers now were turning their attention to trying to get to the North Pole. And in 1875, a British expedition of 2 ships, the Discovery and the Alert, headed up into Davis Strait and Baffin Bay and heading north towards the northernmost tip of Greenland and Ellesmere Island. Now, in those days, we know that Ellesmere Island is an island, and we know what Greenland is like, and we know what Baffin Island is like. But in 1880, they called it Grinnell Land, Ellesmere Land, North Lincoln, North Devon, not knowing whether they were on an island or a point of land or what. And so on their way to the North Pole, they discovered a lot of land coming up from Baffin Bay into the Kane Sea, or the Kane Basin now, up through the Kennedy Channel and out to the open Arctic Ocean. So the British exploration in 1875 founded, they established themselves at a place that's now called Alert, after the name of their ship, and they managed to get out on the coast of Ellesmere Island to the farthest point north they could be on land. So in 1880, that was the year that the British turned the Arctic islands over to Canada. Prior to that, they were just like any other British colony, except there were no people in it, not in the higher parts. And Canada was not that much interested in Arctic exploration because she was still a relatively new country. And in 1880 and 1881 was the start of the Canadian Pacific Railway. So Canadians were much more interested in getting this railway across to confirm Confederation than they were to exploring the Arctic. But in that same year, other scientists were trying to establish research stations in the Arctic all around. So in the circumpolar Arctic in Russia and Scandinavia and Greenland and North American Arctic as well. And that leads us to Greely again. So because there was no Canadian Arctic presence or interest in terms of exploration, the International Polar Year, the first International Polar Year, was a scientific expedition by 15 different countries to establish research stations in the Arctic to study weather, magnetism, tides, and to do basic biological observations. And the Americans signed on to this 15-nation polar year almost at the last minute. And the Americans selected Lieutenant Greely to lead the expedition. He was in the US Army and had no Arctic experience. Few of his men that were hired to join him had any Arctic experience. And they had to hire a Scottish sealing ship, the Proteus, from Newfoundland to establish their research station in the north. So they had a lot of problems getting started. They only got their funding some 2 months before it was time to leave for the Arctic. So there were a lot of things that went wrong just in terms of outfitting the expedition.
Well, that was quite a rough start. And so you can imagine them sailing up Baffin Bay. They, I believe, stuck to the coast of Greenland at first. Very spectacular and beautiful, just as it is on the Canadian coast along Baffin Island. When we sailed up here, what struck us were the icebergs. They're just so beautiful and interesting, and there are different kinds, and they make different sounds, and they have different colors, and they're really very neat to look at. They are calved from the coast of Greenland, from all the glaciers going down to the sea, except that because of global warming, those glaciers have moved back off the coast. So not as many glaciers are dropping into the sea anymore. In any case, when they do drop into the sea, they travel north and then they meet the current coming from the Arctic Ocean, which turns them around, and then they catch the Labrador current going south. And so this is where the glaciers are traveling, icebergs rather, are traveling, and often whales will be in the same sort of pattern. And so we saw some wonderful icebergs. Here is one that everyone on our ship was just oohing and ahhing about. We only see a piece of this. It was a huge iceberg, and we were all busy looking at it, looking through binoculars. When somebody said, "I think there's something yellow. Is there something yellow up here on top of the glacier iceberg?" And so we got out binoculars and had a good look, and David raced up to the bridge and asked the captain if he could go a little bit closer. Well, the captain did go closer, and he actually went around this iceberg several times. And as we got closer, we saw indeed that yellow thing that we saw in the distance was a polar bear and two cubs. And it was quite thrilling to see them traveling on this beautiful iceberg.
So when Greely and the expedition on board the Proteus went up along the coast of Greenland, they stopped at two communities. The first one was at what was then called Godhavn, and now has gone back to its original name of Qeqertarsuaq, which means Big Island. And the people there were very good to them. Again, because they left in such a hurry, they needed still more supplies. They were able to get some more supplies in Greenland. They also stopped at one of the other communities. And these communities in Greenland are just the most spectacular because they all have icebergs in their foreground and in their background. And the people in general live a fairly traditional life. They still do a lot of hunting on the land and on the sea. You see the traditional Greenlandic sleds in everybody's backyard. The original houses that they would have seen in the 1880s were made of stone and turf. But today they're all brightly painted houses. They're really quite beautiful. Every house is a different color. So the Greely expedition hired two men and two teams of dogs. They had hoped to get more people involved and more dogs and more clothing, but because of the time limit, they were not able to do that. So they tried their best to use people that knew what they were doing in the Arctic, but it didn't work as well as they had hoped just because of the timing. So they headed on north up through Baffin Bay and into Kane Basin, and they established their headquarters at Discovery Harbor, which was the same place that the British expedition overwintered at 6 years previously. And they built this huge building, one huge room, and they actually brought with them iron bedsteads so that every man had his own bed. The amount of supplies they brought, some of which were totally unrealistic and unusable, was astounding. But anyway, they established themselves in this thing, and they called it Fort Conger. Conger was an American senator who helped the expedition get going when it was in danger of being canceled. Greely himself had a corner of the building with his own little library and writing desk and a table so that he could get served his own private dinner. He had a curtain system so he could shut himself off from the rest of the men when he was working on his papers and science and whatever. They were equipped with a lot of interesting stuff, but most of it was not really suitable for the Arctic. So you can see in this is a diagram from a newspaper account from that era. But these are the clothes they were wearing: no furs, tight pants, boots that were somewhat insulated, but just not good enough for the Arctic climate. And they had a lot of equipment like this, for example, this ice saw, which they thought they were going to need to saw blocks of ice to melt for cooking water. Totally useless in the high Arctic. You melt snow or get small pieces of ice, or you hack pieces off of an iceberg to melt water. But it just shows that they were probably 50 years late in using technology. They did try to live off the land. In the first year of the expedition, they killed 76 muskoxen. They captured 4 calves live, but weren't able to keep them alive, and they eventually had to kill them and eat them as well. But at least they made an attempt to live off the land to a certain degree. But unfortunately, the number of muskoxen and caribou in the high Arctic is so low that an expedition living off the land with 25 or 30 people for 2 or 3 years would mean that there'd be no muskoxen left to reproduce and replicate the population size. The Greely expedition were the first Americans, first European, first white guys to explore into the center of Ellesmere Island. And so they went about their usual business of naming places after their friends and people who supported them. So this is one of the biggest glaciers that flows across from the big ice cap. And it's called the Henrietta Nesmith Glacier because that was Greely's wife's name. So he named this huge glacier after his wife. Not sure what that says about their relationship, but anyway. Lake Hazen was named after one of the military leaders who helped get the expedition launched. Now this is a kind of a funny colored map, but we wanted to show you the landforms. So everything you see that's red and yellow is actual glacial ice. So it shows the main ice caps of Ellesmere Island. But just to orient you, the Canadian Forces Station Alert is right there up at the north end of the island. The camp that they established at Fort Conger is right here. And this is Lake Hazen, the large lake. So in their 2 years of exploration, they made several trips to the lake, and they made a trip across the island here to this fjord, which was named after Greely. So you can see that they're close to the Arctic Ocean, and this is Nares Strait. You can see even in midsummer, there's still a lot of ice packed against Ellesmere Island, and it only opens up down here. So keep that in mind, that amount of ice surrounding the island. So as well as going across the island, Greely sent a party north to go to the farthest point that the British had reached 6 years before. hoping that they would be able to set a new record for getting farther north. And one of the Greenlanders that they had hired was sent on that expedition to look after the dogs and look after the other two men that were with him. And one of the other three was the expedition doctor, who had had a little bit of Arctic experience. So they traveled up along the coast. This is on the north coast of Ellesmere Island, looking back at Greenland in the distance. And these flat rocks here represent an Inuit hut that was built at some time in the past. And you probably can't see it very well, but down here is the remnants of the British expedition. And the remnants exist in terms of thousands of tin cans, rusty tin cans, all spread across the tundra. In this camp, all that you could see was a few spare bones of fish and caribou. Quite a difference in the way the two groups of people were camping and surviving. I had the privilege of working out of this military station Alert a couple of times, and on one of our trips we were given a helicopter ride to the farthest north part of Ellesmere Island. And as you can see, when you look out from the land, there's nothing between you and the North Pole except an awful lot of very rough, very broken ice. And those three men left the land and headed straight out over that ice until there was so much movement in the ice that they feared they'd never get back. So they didn't actually make it farther north than the British did. They had to retreat. And when we retreated, it wasn't by helicopter. We managed to walk back south, took a week to do it. And on the way, we several times ran into the rare and endangered Peary caribou. And that was a really wonderful thing to see. One of the reasons that the Peary caribou is so rare and endangered is that Peary, the man they're named after, killed so many of them on his trips to the North Pole that they almost didn't survive. On their way back, the Greely expedition stopped at a grave. This was a grave of two of the men who died on the British expedition. And Dr. Pavey in his notes recorded that when they came to the gravesite, there was an Arctic hare huddled against the big stone, taking shelter, whatever shelter he could get. This was wintertime. And on the inscription on the grave marker is the verse from the Bible, "Thou shalt wash me and I shall be whiter than snow." And he thought it was really cool that a white, perfectly white Arctic hare was sheltered right under that same sign. So when they explored into Ellesmere Island from Fort Conger, this aerial photograph shows you the location of Fort Conger and the location of Lake Hazen. And they had to travel all this way to get to Lake Hazen. And you can see some of the smaller ice caps still there in midsummer, but I just want you to notice that the whole area is still basically ice covered in midsummer, and it's only starting to break up in a few places.
And here we are at Lake Hazen. I haven't been there. I feel as though I have, but David's been there a couple of times. The reason I feel I've been there is because David and I are writing a biography now about a man who was a paleontologist, and he spent his first job was spent right here at Lake Hazen, and he lived here for a year with 3 other young men, doing weather work, meteorological work, and he loved that year, and his journals are just filled with wonderful descriptions of this lake. Lake Hazen is the second biggest lake north of the Arctic Circle. It's 75 kilometers long and 12 kilometers wide. The only thing it produces is Arctic char, but wonderful, huge Arctic char. It's a very deep lake. Greely visited here twice, as David showed you, and he was very impressed with it as well. He gives a wonderful quote. The sky was partly covered with true cumulus clouds, quite rare in the Arctic heavens. The sun marked with checkered bars of sunshine and shadow, the babbling river, the blue pool, which was Lake Hazen, and its noisy occupants. The temperature was high, and the gay yellow poppies and other flowers drew to them gaudy butterflies. So if you can imagine, in this ice-clad land, yellow poppies and gaudy butterflies. Greely said you can just imagine that you're in the south if you turn your back to the ice island in the middle of the lake and the huge glaciers pouring into the lake.
Well, I can attest to the fact that the waters of Lake Hazen come straight from the glaciers, because one day when I was working at an abandoned camp doing a sort of a biological assessment of the damage this camp had created, I was digging soil samples and mucking around in a burnt out building. And I thought, oh, it would be really nice to go for a swim. So I shed my clothes and I ran into the water, and it was so cold that I immediately ran right back out again. And so seeing my clothes on the beach is the closest I have to documenting my little swim in Lake Hazen. Right next to the area where I was working is the Ruggles River, which is the outlet for Lake Hazen. And in this photograph, you can see that even though it's the middle of summer, there's still a big chunk of the lake covered in ice. And so it's really a remarkable lake. And it only has this one big river that feeds out into the ocean. So when Greely when he first saw Lake Hazen on the north coast, he found an old stone shelter that had been used by the Inuit some within the last 100 or so years probably. And these round shelters are very common throughout the whole Arctic. In most places they're called kalmak, and the main feature is a circle of stones, a divided platform. So at the entrance door, the platform is the lowest part of the hut. And whether the foundation was big stones or small stones or bowhead whale skulls or whatever, the same structure was made all across the Arctic. And sometimes they used wood if they had driftwood, sometimes bowhead whale bones, and sometimes baleen to tie over for protection with skins, muskox hides or caribou hides or seal or walrus hides. And this is actually Sally snoozing in one of the old huts on northern Baffin Island. So in this circle of stones, Greely found all of these objects we see on the left here. A lot of them are very beautifully carved. These are actually women's combs, and some of those are really quite beautiful. These are various tools of the men. There was even a piece of fur in one of them, and odd fragments of other tools. Because most of them were broken, it's likely that they just left that stuff behind made new things and carried the new things away with them, but all these things that have been repaired over the years, they didn't bother to take with them. So archaeology was part of the observations that Greely made. And also they collected specimens, partly for food. This is a bearded seal that they had shot. So they used it for food, but they also preserved the skins. So one of their duties was to collect these skins and nests of birds and all that sort of thing as well. Now the expedition was to have been resupplied in the summer of 1882 by the same ship that brought them in 1881, but that ship was not able to get to them and got crushed and sank in the ice south of where they were supposed to drop the supplies for Greely. And then the second year, 1883, 2 ships were sent again to resupply Greely. Because of the ice conditions and the lack of experienced captains and pilots, they were not able to get far enough north to bring the supplies to Greely. And for some crazy reason, on the way south, they did not leave depots of food for Greely to use on his retreat that was going to be necessary, because they didn't get to him. So there was all kinds of investigations into why that happened, but the impact of that was pretty severe for the Greely expedition. So they had spent one good winter at Fort Conger, and a second winter that wasn't too bad at Fort Conger. But for those of us who have experienced even a little bit of an Arctic winter, it's astounding to us what happened in the winter of 1883. So this photograph is a day in the middle of winter at noon. So you can see that, yeah, you can see your way to get around at noon, but most of the day you cannot. And in the Arctic, you have to rely on the moon, because the sun at that latitude is not coming up between the middle of November and the middle of February.
David mentioned the cold. We had the opportunity to go to Grise Fjord, which is the most northerly community in Canada. And there it is, that little tiny strip of houses in front of the cliff. And in front of the houses is the ocean. You see the bay there, but clogged with ice. That's the way it is most of the year. But what a lovely little community, very warm and friendly. Kids dropped in to say hello, and in our hotel, and we were invited for dinner to friends of David's. It was just a wonderful thing. We were supposed to be there for 4 days, but we got snowed in, so we ended up being there for a week. And it was in March, and as far as I'm concerned, it was the trip of my lifetime. It was just fabulous to be there. But it was cold, and David talked about cold, and I think of Greely and his crew. They just weren't equipped. They had no idea. But I had layers and layers and layers on, and very thick snow pants. And within about 10 minutes, I could feel the cold moving in. It was unbelievable. It was kind of sobering to realize that this transplanted community, who had been plunked right there where Grise Fjord is, they weren't even equipped to live there, but they were left there. So they had to, and they survived. But it's incredible what Greely was up against.
So what Greely was up against is a 500-kilometer journey south in their one small steam launch, towing a couple of small, even smaller boats with the rest of the men in. And they were out in moving waters where the Labrador Current is moving down fairly quickly from the Arctic with all this ice in it, pushing them around, drifting them off course, changing direction depending on which way the wind was blowing. They spent several weeks being, they managed to pull the boats up and tie them to a fairly large ice pan, and they drifted for 3 weeks around in circles. And it wasn't until, well, much later in the fall, when they finally landed at a place called Cape Sabine. And unfortunately, they landed on the cape of an island, and they hadn't realized that it was an island. And there was nothing else, no game or anything living on that island. And so by the time they realized that, it was too late to go anywhere else. And so these 26 men were living in a rock structure with one of their boats on top as a roof. And one of their Greenland hunters, the Evans Edwards, was out in a kayak trying to spear a seal to feed them. And unfortunately, his kayak capsized and he drowned in the icy water. And that was just the start of a whole situation of men getting frozen, starving to death. The whole winter just went from bad to worse. And so in the spring of 1884, the American government and the British government both sent ships to try to rescue the Greely expedition. The ice was bad. They had notified all the Scottish and American whalers. There was a bit of a race to see who could rescue Greely. So there were several ships going into the ice that spring. And by the time they got to Cape Sabine, there were only 6 men alive, one of them being Greely. Sorry, 7 men alive, one of them being Greely. And the scene that they encountered was pretty awful. There were bodies lying outside the structure. There were bodies inside the structure. Most of the men who were alive were in this very small tent that you can see here. So the rescue party is lifting the men onto stretchers, taking the dead men out of the tent. It was just a horrible situation. But Greely was one of the survivors. There were 7 men alive. One of them died shortly after on board the ship. That man named Ellison had lost both his feet and 1.5 of his hands to frostbite and decay. But he was still alive when the rescuers showed up, but he didn't make it to the south. So that was the end of what can be considered a disastrous expedition. But I want to talk a little bit now about Fort Conger today. Fort Conger is in Kootenay National Park. Kootenay is Inuktitut for the top of the world. And when they abandoned Fort Conger, the whole big building was still there with all kinds of their equipment that they left behind. When they had to leave in a hurry in those small boats, they were not able to take all of the items they had collected, their archaeological specimens, their natural history specimens, but they did take all of their weather records and all the other scientific data. So that was saved. But they left behind the incredible amount of stuff. These are iron bedsteads in the lower photograph. These piles of rust are actually kegs of nails where the The wooden keg has disappeared, but the nails are all still there. It was just an incredible thing. So when Peary, the American explorer trying to be the first to get to the North Pole, when he got to Fort Conger, he took down the whole big building and made these 4 little huts, which is more like the Inuit style of living close to the ground, so you don't have to heat up all the air, and a smaller number of people in each one. Fort Conger today has been visited by a number of cruise ships, and it's an important part of Kutturpak National Park for visitors. So they've done a fair number of different studies of the soil and trampling and effect of people visiting on wildlife in that park. And the other thing that has happened is that people in the past, let's say 50 years, have taken objects from this historic site. This is the back deck of a Canadian icebreaker, the Louis Saint Laurent, that was up at Alert in 1971. And on the way back, they stopped at Fort Greely, and somebody collected all these historic artifacts from the Greely expedition, and nobody knows where they went. So all that stuff is totally lost. When I was doing some work on an exhibit about Arctic exploration in the Canadian Museum of History collection, I found this box, which is labeled explosives and comes from the 1950s, and was full of all of these objects. Some of these bottles full of a mysterious white powder, and parts of scientific apparatus. This and this and this are actually the wind cups from an anemometer that was on the roof of the Greely building at Fort Conger. And so it was part of the information that they got in those 2 years of study. And they were labeled soup ladles in the museum collection. So nobody knew what they were, so I guess it's for ladling soup. So, as I mentioned, they did some biological sampling there, and one of the teams that was there found this patch of white on the ground next to a tin can that had been cut open with a knife. And when they sampled the white stuff, it turned out to be pure arsenic. Now, why would they have had arsenic at that Fort Conger? 2 reasons. Arsenic was actually part of a first aid kit back in those days. And the second thing, probably the most likely, was that arsenic was used to help preserve skins of specimens. So birds and mammal skins that they were collecting to take back as museum specimens would have been treated with arsenic to prevent them from decaying. Well, as you can see, those huts of Fort Conger, or what's left of Fort Conger, are close to the ocean, and they found that the arsenic was traveling in the water table past the huts down into the actual Arctic Ocean. So they wanted to corral all the arsenic and remove it. Now, the interesting thing is when they dug up the ground to get rid of the arsenic, they found a whole bunch of Inuit artifacts. And I was in a meeting in Calgary one time representing the park, and saw the photographs that they had of these artifacts that they got out of the arsenic contaminated soil. And I said, I know those artifacts. Those are the ones that Greely collected and left behind. And sure enough, it turned out that most of these artifacts that Greely had photographs of, but had not taken them with him, were the ones that turned up in the excavation of the arsenic. So, bringing things back to where we started, Greely as a person, a place, and things. Greely was treated as a hero when he got back to the United States, in spite of the fact that he lost most of his men, but they had accomplished what they set out to do. They took 2 years of weather and tidal bearings and magnetic observations that were really important for the whole world, because it was one station out of 15 all around the circumpolar north. And it was those observations that allowed people to start to understand a little bit about climate change in the Arctic. So Greely was a hero. The expedition was successful. Greely is remembered for what he did. We actually had an exhibit at the Museum of History that showed some of his scientific instruments. So he was remembered and noticed by a lot of people in the Ottawa-Gatineau area a few years ago. And we know now that Greely, the post office, and Greely, the town, if they didn't name it after this Greely, then they probably should have, because he was an important man of the time, and lots of people in this area would have known about his exploits and would have appreciated what he did. So we'll stop there.
Wow, what an incredible story. And I just want to, again, extend our sincere thanks to you, Sally and David, for your excellent presentation, just giving us a little bit of insight into Greely the person and the Arctic landscape. And it's something that, you know, a lot of Canadians don't have the opportunity to experience. So it was just a wonderful presentation. I'll open up the floor to questions. We have gone a little bit over time. However, if anyone has any questions, feel free to throw those into the chat box at the bottom. We do also have a raised hand function. If you're comfortable with using that too, we can find your raised hand and feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. If you're short on time tonight, please do also email us. There should have been Education at Osgoode Museum contact with your Eventbrite link if you have any questions to ask to David and Sally, and we can respond through email as well. So one comment that we have here, very interesting, especially the photographs and the maps. Absolutely, yes. Lots of thank you and great presentations. I have a quick question for both of you, actually. What's your favorite, or what has been your favorite experience in the Arctic, in your experience?
Oh, golly. Have you one?
For me, it's easy. When we were in Grise Fjord, David's friend is Luti Piamini. He is one of the foremost carvers and Inuit carvers. And I spent an afternoon with him in his workshop, watching him carve a long narwhal tusk. And that was just the most magical afternoon. We listened to CBC and he explained all sorts of things to me, and his shop smelled like a dentist's office. And he was just doing, I wish I could show you the pictures. He was doing the most unbelievable carving while I watched. So that was my moment. That you must have thousands of them.
I've got so many good memories, but I'll share one that happened in Ellesmere Island, within range of where Greely and his men were. And it ties in with the Kutlunerpak National Park. I'm on a park management committee. I'm the only white guy on the committee. Most of the other members are Inuit elders. And we were in Tankery Fjord at the park office, the park camp there, the one that most visitors go to. And when I got off the plane, one of the camp people rushed up to me and she said, David, an Arctic hare gave birth to their kids right here in the middle of camp. And I said, wow, that's great. And then I looked at my watch and I said, she'll be back to feed them in 18 and a half hours from now. We'll be able to watch it happen again. And sure enough, I was able to get everybody to come out at 3 o'clock in the morning to wait for the Arctic hare female to come back and nurse her young. Because several years ago, when we have been studying Arctic hares, we discovered that they don't do it every 24 hours like you would expect in the south. Because of the sun being up 24 hours a day, they use a biological clock that both the mother and the kids work with. And so for 4 days, our little committee meetings would be broken up at whatever time the Arctic hare was due to come back and nurse her young. And the elders and I, we had so much fun joking about how this Kalunat, this white guy from the south, could teach them something about their Arctic hares.
I have 3 questions that have come up. So if we have the time, I'll start with the first one here. What would have been the population of Inuit prior in the Arctic prior to the Arctic explorers arriving? A good question.
That's a good question. I don't know that. What I do know is that when the first Canadian census was done in the Pond Inlet area, North Baffin Island, in 1911, and they recorded something like 75 Inuit in that northern part of Baffin Island where Pond Inlet and Arctic Bay are the established settlements today. There were very few people living on Ellesmere Island at that time. And it wasn't until the 1950s when people were relocated to Ellesmere Island that there was any population. So of people who were nomadic in the high Arctic islands, I would say there would, I'm just going to make a guess of 10,000 people. But I may be way off. I don't actually know the answer to that question.
Yeah, and it's kind of a bit of a vague question too, because Inuit have lived in that area and had that territory for thousands of years. So it's I'm sure the population would have fluctuated over time as well. We have another question here. How were dogs introduced to Inuit?
These questions were not quite important.
I would say that the Inuit probably had dogs before they came across from Asia to North America. I don't know that, but we know definitely that the Thule people had dogs. Did the Independence people have dogs? I'm not sure if we know that or not. So certainly 1,000 years ago, whether they had them 4,000 years ago, I don't know.
Right. Yeah, no, that's an interesting question. And kind of looping it back to Greely, did Greely travel north again ever after the expedition in the 1880s?
No, he didn't. He was given the job of the chief in charge of wireless. What's the word I'm looking for? Stringing telegraph cables across the United States and in South America, and I think in Cuba maybe as well. So he finished his career in the Army as the head of the whole telegraph wireless, not wireless, the telegraph wire system across the United States. He was the first president of the Explorers Club in New York, but he never did go back to the Arctic.
One last question that we have here. Have you noticed any changes in the Arctic environment over the years of visiting? That's a great question.
Oh, yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, there's, I mean, I've been up to a number of different places over several years and seen a lot of changes, but the way I see the changes through the eyes of the people that I've gotten to know in different communities, and hearing the stories of how they can't trust the sea ice anymore. They can't teach their grandchildren how to hunt on the sea ice because they don't know what's happening. And so the biggest changes are in the shortening of the winter season, the shortening of the safe time to hunt on the ice, the shortening of the time to travel on the ice, different conditions, different animals coming into the territory. So it's a gradual change in a lot of different things, all connected with climate change.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something for all of us to think about, our future impacts. Yeah. Well, I think that's it for questions. Again, if you have any questions that you'd like to direct at David and Sally, please feel free to email us. And again, we just want to thank David and Sally for joining us tonight and teaching us a bit about their experiences in the Arctic.
Could I just say one welcome? I believe we have a couple here from India in the audience.
Wow.
They're international students. We also have an international student from Iran. So we just want to give a cheer to them for coming on an Arctic journey in their first year in Canada.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us. Oh, great. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we appreciate joining us on a Friday night. And be sure to check out our website for future museum talks this year. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Everyone.
Bye.